The Ice Princess by Camilla Lackberg. Part 3. A murmur spread through the room. When Nellie Lawrence stepped through the door, the others held their breath from sheer astonishment. Since the early 50s, the continued livelihood of Fjällbacka had waxed or waned with the Lawrence cannery. Almost half of the able-bodied residents of Fjällbacka were employed at the factory, and the Lawrence family was regarded as royalty in the little town. From their elevated position in the enormous villa at the top of the hill, they looked down on Fjällbacka with guarded superiority. Mrs. Lawrence graciously allowed Henrik to help her off with her fur coat. He led her over to the sofa in the middle where Birgit and Karl-Erik were sitting, as she briefly nodded a greeting to a select few of the other guests. One of those who had graciously been granted a nod was Erika. Due to her quasi-celebrity status, she had apparently been found worthy, even prompting an invitation to come to tea with Nellie Lawrence after her parents' death. Erika had politely declined, giving as an excuse that she was still in mourning. Erika estimated Nellie's age to be a bit over 80. It was rumoured that in her youth she'd been a dancer, and that she'd met Fabian Lawrence when she was part of a ballet company at a theatre in Göteborg. After a few minutes of hushed conversation, Nellie left the grieving parents and went out onto the veranda to sit with Alex's sister Julia. No one gave the slightest indication that they found this rather strange. For the first time that day, Erika saw a smile spread across Julia's face. She hopped down from the windowsill and sat next to Nellie on the rattan sofa, and there they sat with their heads close together, whispering. What could such a mismatched pair have in common? Erika cast a look in Birgit's direction. Birgit had fixed her gaze on her daughter and Nellie Lawrence with a look of naked horror. Erika decided to accept that invitation from Mrs. Lawrence after all. It might be interesting to have a little chat with her in private. Patrick felt a little nervous. It was a long time since he had made dinner for a woman moreover for whom he felt a strong attraction. "How have you been?" Patrick peered at Erika from under the hair hanging into his eyes. Erika put down her cutlery. Hesitantly, she said, "I may have something that could be of interest." She reached for her handbag and pulled out a piece of paper which she handed to him across the table. It was a copy from an article from Bohuslänningen. There was no date, but based on the typeface and black and white picture, he could see that it wasn't recent. He raised a questioning eyebrow. "What does this have to do with Alex?" "That's what I was wondering too. I found it in a bureau drawer, hidden beneath Alex's underwear." "What do you mean you found it? When did you have the chance to go through her bureau drawers?" He saw her blush. "What else do you know about this?" he asked, waving the article. "Factually, no more than what's there. That Nils Lawrence, son of Fabian and Nellie Lawrence, disappeared without a trace in January of 1977. No body was ever found. On the other hand, there has been a good deal of speculation over the years. Some people think that he drowned and the body washed out to sea. Other rumours say that he embezzled a large amount of money from his father and then fled the country. What I heard was that Nils Lawrence wasn't a nice person, so most people lean towards the latter alternative. The only heir to the fortune is now a foster son they took in about a year before Nils vanished. Nellie adopted him a couple of years after her husband died. Well, that's just a small sampling of the local gossip. I still don't understand how this could have any bearing on Alex's death. The only dealings the families ever had with each other were when Karl-Erik worked in the office at the Lawrence cannery when Alex and I were little, before they moved to Göteborg. But That was over 25 years ago. And then, according to her best friend Francine, Henrik isn't the father of Alex's child. Patrick raised an eyebrow and whistled. And the forensics found evidence that she'd given birth at some point in the past, too. Francine told me that Alex had met someone here in Fjällbacka, and she drove here every weekend to see him. She was overjoyed about the baby, and that's why Francine insisted so strongly that her death wasn't suicide. In her view, Alex was happy for the first time in her life. Did she know who the man was? No, she didn't. Alex kept that information to herself. But why would her husband put up with her driving to Fjällbacka every weekend without him? Did he know that she was meeting someone here? Patrick took another sip of wine. Do you think that's what might have happened? That one day the rejected husband had enough and he killed the unfaithful wife? I don't know, Patrick. I really don't know. But now I think we should drink more than our share of wine and talk about all sorts of things, as long as it doesn't have to do with murder and sudden death. He willingly agreed and raised his glass in a toast. Nelly had sounded a bit surprised when Erika called. The drawing room she was ushered into was exquisitely beautiful. The view stretched from the harbour at one end to the open horizon beyond the islands at the other. They sat down on an elegant sofa group, and Erika was served small canapes from a silver tray. The conversation flowed slowly but politely. They kept the topics of conversation neutral, circling round the subject they both knew that they would have to broach sooner or later. It was Erika who finally got up the courage. Well, the last time we saw each other it was under rather sad circumstances. Yes, so tragic. Such a young woman. I didn't realize that you knew the Karlgrens so well. Karl-Erik worked for us for many years, and of course we met his family on numerous occasions. It seemed only right to express my condolences in person. Nelly lowered her eyes. Erika saw that her hands were fidgeting nervously in her lap. I got the impression that you also knew Julia. She wasn't even born when the Karlgrens lived in Fjällbacka, was she? No more than a stiffening of her back and a slight movement of her head indicated that Nelly found the question uncomfortable. She waved a hand covered with gold jewellery. No, Julia is a new acquaintance, but I think she's a very enchanting young lady. Yes, I know that she may not have the same outer beauty as Alexandra, but unlike her sister, she has a strength of will and a courage that makes me view her as considerably more interesting than her foolish sibling. Before Nelly had a chance to say more, the telephone rang. With obvious relief, she excused herself and went to answer it. Erika took the opportunity to snoop around the room. It was beautiful but impersonal. She turned her attention to a desk in one corner of the room. She was tempted to peek in the drawers, but wasn't sure how long Nelly would be gone. The wastebasket attracted Erika's attention instead. There were some crumpled papers in it. She took out the paper ball on top and gently smoothed it out. She read it with growing interest, then carefully replaced it in the wastebasket. She heard someone clear his throat behind her. Jan Lawrence was standing in the doorway, his eyebrows raised quizzically. She wondered how long he'd been standing there. Erika Falk, isn't it? Yes, that's right. And you must be Nelly's son Jan. Also correct. Pleased to meet you. You're a bit of a topic of conversation here in town, you should know. He gave her a big smile and came towards her with outstretched hand. She took it reluctantly. He looked as though he'd come directly from a business meeting, wearing a well-pressed suit and with a briefcase in his hand. Erika knew that he was the one who ran the family business, and very successfully. "So, Mother has finally managed to entice you here. You've been high on the wish list ever since you published your first book, I must tell you. I heard about your parents. Very tragic. I really must express my sincere condolences." He managed a sympathetic smile, but the emotion never reached his eyes. Nellie came back into the room. Jan bent over to kiss his mother on the cheek. She let him do it with an indifferent expression. Then a grimace of pain swept across her face and she grabbed her right arm. "Mother, what is it? Are you in pain? Shall I fetch your pills?" Nellie brusquely shook him off. "No, there's nothing wrong with me. Just the aches and pains of age, that's all. Shouldn't you be at the factory, by the way?" "Yes, I just dashed home to pick up some papers." "Well, I suppose I should leave you ladies alone. Don't overexert yourself, Mother. Remember what the doctor said." His face showed a concern that seemed genuine, but Erika could swear that she saw a tiny smile at the corners of his mouth when he left the room. "It must be a comfort to have a son who can carry on the family business," Erika said. "From what I understand, Jan and his wife live here with you." "A comfort? Yes, perhaps it is. But enough about me and my family. Are you working on a new book? Haven't you ever thought about writing something, what should I say, non-biographical?" "Of course, I've had some thoughts in that direction," Erika said. "But at the moment I'm swamped with the Lagerlöf project. After that we'll see what happens." She glanced at the clock. Speaking of my writing, unfortunately I really have to get going. Thank you so much for tea, and the delicious canapes." "Think nothing of it. It was delightful to have you here." Nellie rose graciously from the sofa. Now there was no sign of her aches and pains. "I'll see you out. In the old days our maid Vera would have done that, but times change. Maids aren't fashionable anymore." Vera Nilsson put the coffee on the stove to boil. The ticking of the kitchen clock was the only sound to be heard. Sometimes she missed the old days. Missed the security of going to the same place of work, the status that went along with being the housekeeper for the wealthiest family in northern Bohuslän. But she didn't always feel that way. Most often she was glad that she didn't have to go there every day, that she no longer needed to bow and scrape to Nellie Lawrence. The house was small and simple. Here she had lived for almost 40 years, and here she intended to stay until the day she died. She gave a start when the telephone rang. "Mama, it's me." Anders was slurring his words, and from years of experience she knew precisely what stage of intoxication he was in. She sighed. "Hello, Anders. How's it going?" He ignored the question. She'd had countless conversations like this. Vera could see herself in the hall mirror as she stood with the receiver to her ear. Her hair was shabby and grey, with its original dark colour still visible here and there. She always combed her hair straight back and cut it herself with nail scissors in front of the bathroom mirror. No sense throwing money away on a hairdresser. She suddenly registered what Anders was saying on the other end of the line. "Mama, there are police cars outside. It's a hell of an escort. It must be me they're after. It has to be. What the hell should I do?" An icy cold spread through her body. In the mirror she saw that she was holding the phone with white knuckles. "Don't do anything, Anders. Just wait there. I'm coming." Okay, but hurry up for God's sake. This isn't the usual way the cops arrive. Mama, they usually come in one car, and now there are three cars outside with all their blue lights and sirens going. Anders, listen to me now. Take a deep breath and calm down. I'm going to hang up and I'll be there as quick as I can. It took her almost 10 minutes to reach the block of flats where Anders lived. She got there in time to see two burly policemen lead him away in handcuffs. A shriek surged up in her chest, but she forced it back when she saw all the neighbours hanging out their windows like snooping vultures. There was no way she was going to give them more of a show than what they had already witnessed. Her pride was all she had left. The police cars began driving off one by one. In the last one, she saw Anders sitting between two officers. He turned round as they pulled away and looked at her until they drove out of sight. The cell was very familiar. It wasn't the first time he had sat there, although this time it was different. This time it was serious. He lay down on his side on the hard cot. Cold shivers ran through him, from a combination of the cold in the cell and the alcohol deprivation in his body. The only thing he'd been told was that he was suspected of murdering Alex. Then they shoved him into the cell and told him to wait. What else did they think he was going to do in this cold place? Teach courses in life drawing? The walls were painted light green over worn concrete, with grey spots where the paint had flaked off. In his mind, he painted the walls in bold colours, a brushstroke of red here, one of yellow there. Only then could he focus his thoughts. Alex was dead. That wasn't a thought he could flee from, even if he wanted to. It was an irrefutable fact. She was dead, and his future was dead with her. Patrick's finger was shaking as he pressed the doorbell. No one came to the door, so he rang the doorbell again. Oh, this was definitely starting to feel like a bad idea. He could hear someone coming down the stairs. The footsteps paused for a moment, then the door opened, and there Erika stood with a big smile. The house looked exactly the same as always, the way he remembered it from his visits as a child. She had lit candles to drive away the winter darkness. The whole place breathed calm and tranquility. He followed her out to the kitchen. "Would you like some coffee?" "Yes, please." They smiled at each other. "How's the investigation going?" she said. Patrick thought for a moment. "It looks like we've probably solved it. We actually have a suspect in custody, Anders Nilsson." So it was Anders after all. Strange, but that doesn't feel quite right. Patrick was inclined to agree with her. There were simply too many loose ends that couldn't be tied up by Anders's arrest. But the physical evidence from the murder scene, and the testimony of witnesses, that he was in the house not only on the night that Alex was presumably murdered, but also on a number of other occasions after she was killed, didn't leave much room for doubt. And yet... Well, I suppose it's all over then. Funny, I thought I'd feel more relieved. What about the article I found? The one about Nils's disappearance, I mean. How does that fit into the picture if Anders is the killer? I just don't know, Erika. I don't know. Maybe it had nothing to do with the murder. Pure coincidence. In any case, there's no reason to rummage through everything anymore. Alex took her secrets with her to the grave. And the baby she was expecting? Was it Anders's? Who knows? Anders's, her husband's... Your guess is as good as mine. I really wonder what got Alex and Anders together. I find it hard to believe that he could get anyone into bed. Talk about odd couples. She was just opening her mouth to say something when the theme song from an ice cream advert was heard from the hall. Both Patrick and Erika gave a start. "It's my mobile," Patrick said. "Excuse me for a moment." "Patrick Hagstrom?" "Mm-hmm. Okay, I get it." "Well, then we're back at square one again." Yeah, I know." "Oh, so he said that? Well, you couldn't have known about that." "Oh, okay, Superintendent. I'll see you later." He flipped his phone closed with a decisive click. "Throw on a jacket and let's take a ride. There's new information about Anders's involvement. It looks like we have to cross him off the suspect list." "But where are we going?" "You found the article about Nils's disappearance at Alex's house. There may be more things to find there." Patrick was already halfway out the door. Erika had to throw on her jacket and run after him. Someone had got the furnace started again. The temperature inside was now considerably warmer than outside. "Now what do we do?" Erika crossed her arms and gave Patrick a questioning look. "Sometime after 7:15, Alex ingested a large quantity of sedatives. There was no sign that anyone broke in, so in all probability that means she had a visit from someone she knew, someone who then had the opportunity to give her the sedatives. How did this someone manage to do that? Well, they must have had something to eat or drink together." Patrick was pacing up and down in the living room as he spoke. Erika sat down on the sofa and watched with interest. "What seems a bit strange is that in the fridge there were 2 large fillet steaks, and in the oven there was a frozen potato dish. But the oven wasn't on, and the potato dish was still raw. There was also a bottle of wine on the worktop. It was opened and about 5 ounces were gone. That corresponds to about 1 glass." Patrick measured the amount between his thumb and index finger. "But there was no wine in Alex's stomach." Erika was leaning forward with interest, resting her elbows on her knees. "No, precisely. Since she was pregnant, she must have drank cider instead of wine. But the question is, who drank the wine?" "Were there any dirty dishes?" "Yes, there was a plate, a fork, and a knife with remnants of fish casserole on it. There were also 2 glasses in the sink. 1 glass was full of fingerprints, Alex's, but there were no prints on the other glass." He stopped pacing and sat down in the easy chair facing Erika. "But why would a woman abandon a feast and instead heat up something in the microwave?" "Because she planned a romantic dinner for 2, but her date never showed up?" "That's my guess too," Patrick said. "She waited and waited, but finally gave up. We know Anders actually came here for a visit, so it mustn't have been him she was waiting for." "How about the child's father?" said Patrick. "How tragic," Erika said. "Here she's prepared the world's greatest dinner and put wine in the fridge to cool, maybe to celebrate the baby, what do I know, and then he doesn't show up. So she sits here waiting and waiting. The question is, who came over instead?" "We can't rule out the person she was waiting for," said Patrick. "He could have still shown up later than expected." "And how did she end up in the bathtub?" Erika said. "I think that the killer waited until Alex fell asleep, undressed her, and dragged her into the bathroom. After the killer got Alex into the tub, it was a simple matter to run the water and then slit her wrists. Then all the killer had to do was clean up after himself, rinse out the glasses, and wipe off the fingerprints from one of them. Meanwhile, Alex slowly bled to death in the bathroom. Terribly, terribly cold-hearted." "And the furnace? Was it already off when she arrived in Fjällbacka?" "Yes, it seems so, which was lucky for us. It would have been much harder to gather any evidence from the body if it had been in room temperature for a whole week." Together they searched the rest of the house. Erica took time to go through the bedroom more thoroughly. The feeling that something was missing lingered. Patrick looked quite uneasy when she told him about the intruder and how she had been forced to hide in the wardrobe. He sat down on the edge of the big four-poster bed, trying to help her figure out what it was she was searching for. But where in the room was it? By the door? Over by the bed? On the bureau? He fingered a little scrap of leather. It looked like some sort of club insignia, with an inscription burned into the leather in a childish hand. TTM 1976. When he turned it over, he saw some indistinct spots of what looked like old dried blood. He wondered where it had come from. I don't know what it was, Patrick. She glanced at him in profile. There was a moment's silence. Well, what do you say? We're not going to get any further now, do you think? Erica said at last. No, probably not. But listen, ring me as soon as you think of what's missing. They locked up carefully, and Erica placed the key back under the mat. Would you like a ride back? No thanks, Patrick. I'll enjoy the walk. See you tomorrow night, then. Patrick shifted from one foot to the other, feeling like an awkward 15-year-old. Come hungry, Erica said. She smiled and waved as he drove off in his Volvo. She started for home, but hadn't gone more than a few yards before she stopped short. An idea had come out of nowhere, and it had to be tested before she could let it go. She took the key from under the mat and entered the house again. What should a woman do who was waiting for a man who never showed up for a romantic dinner? She should ring him, of course. A brand new Doro hung on the wall in the kitchen. With trembling fingers, she pushed the button for the last number called and crossed her fingers that nobody had used the phone since Alex's death. The phone rang and rang. After 7 rings, she was about to hang up, but then the voicemail switched on. She listened to the message but hung up before the beep. Her face pale, Erica slowly replaced the receiver. She could almost hear the clatter in her head as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Suddenly, she knew precisely what it was that was missing from the bedroom upstairs. Alex Tregear was reading The Ice Princess by Camilla Lackberg. The translator was Stephen T. Murray. The Ice Princess was abridged for radio by Alison Joseph and produced by Gemma Jenkins.